All right, so Thanksgiving. Everyone thinks they know the story, right? Pilgrims, Mayflower, Plymouth Rock, big feast with Native Americans. But we're going to dive deep into some sources you guys sent in, and, well, let's just say there's a lot more to it.
Yeah, the traditional Thanksgiving story is pretty sanitized. A lot of myth and a very specific perspective. It's really interesting how history gets shaped to fit a certain narrative.
Exactly. And the narrative we all got, it's, pretty feel good, seeking religious freedom, landing at Plymouth Rock, heartwarming feast.
Right, but that seeking religious freedom part, it needs some unpacking. These weren't just any folks looking for a place to worship. These were extremist Puritans called separatists.
Separatists, what does that even mean?
Well, it means they wanted to completely break away from the Church of England, thought it was corrupt, beyond saving, wanted to set up their own pure theocratic society based on their strict interpretation of the Bible.
Okay, so not just tolerance. They wanted to create their own strict religious community.
Exactly. And get this, they were so radical that they actually got kicked out of Holland.
Holland, you mean the Netherlands, the place known for being super tolerant of different religions.
That's the one. They were too extreme even for them. Wild, right?
That is wild. Okay, so these pilgrims, they were intense.
Intense is a good word. And that context, their extreme beliefs, it's crucial when we look at how they interacted with the Native Americans. But before we get there, there's something else that often gets left out of the Thanksgiving story. Disease.
Oh, right, because it wasn't all, peace and harmony when the pilgrims showed up.
No, not at all. Their arrival coincided with a horrific smallpox epidemic, ripped through Native American populations all along the coast.
So the pilgrims brought smallpox with them.
It's more complicated than that. They didn't intentionally use it as a weapon or anything, but their arrival did correspond with this massive outbreak. Devastated native tribes, weakened them significantly before major conflicts even arose.
That's awful. Adds a whole other layer to this story, especially when you consider the power dynamics between them and the Native Americans.
Definitely. And it's something to keep in mind when we talk about that famous first Thanksgiving feast in 1621.
All right, the feast. I have a feeling it wasn't just a happy little celebration of, friendship and gratitude.
Well, historians debate the real nature of the event. Some argue that the Pilgrims invited the Wampanoag leader, Massasoit, and his men as a strategic move. They were outnumbered, needed allies in this new land.
So maybe the first Thanksgiving was more about survival and power than just, sharing a meal.
It's definitely possible. And you got to remember, the Wampanoag probably brought most of the food, and they would see the event through their own cultural lens, which was probably very different from the Pilgrims.
Okay, so this whole image of a peaceful, harmonious feast, it's kind of falling apart.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing things didn't stay peaceful for long after that.
You guessed right. Things went downhill pretty fast. Relations between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans, they deteriorated quickly. Brutal conflicts with other tribes, and the Pilgrims, well, they engaged in some pretty horrific acts.
How horrific are we talking here?
We're talking displaying the severed heads of their enemies. Horrific. Really dark chapter in history that gets, glossed over a lot when we talk about Thanksgiving.
Wow. Thanksgiving is suddenly feeling a lot less festive. Okay, so we've established that the real Pilgrim story is, well, a lot more complicated and brutal than the traditional narrative. But why does any of this matter today? Why should we care about revising this centuries-old history?
That's where things get really interesting. This isn't just about correcting the historical record. It's about understanding how this tendency to embrace magical thinking, as the author Kurt Andersen calls it, has been part of America's identity from the very beginning.
Magical thinking. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more. What does that have to do with the Pilgrims?
Andersen, in his book Fantasyland, argues that America has this long history of embracing fantasy, religion, conspiracy theories, our current political climate. And he sees the Pilgrims, their unwavering belief in their own righteousness, their intolerance, their willingness to rewrite reality to fit their narrative, as an early example of this.
So you're saying that the Pilgrims' mindset, their magical thinking, is somehow woven into, the DNA of American culture.
It might sound like a stretch, but think about it. They abandoned their homeland, risked a dangerous journey across the ocean, faced incredible hardship, all based on this unshakable belief in a specific vision. And as we've seen, that vision wasn't exactly grounded in reality. Andersen says this same impulse, this desire to shape reality to fit a narrative, it's popped up throughout American history.
I see where you're going with this. I think our listeners probably do too, but let's get specific. You mentioned that Anderson connects this magical thinking to our current political climate. What does he mean by that?
Well, this deep dive was specifically requested after the recent election.
The one where Donald Trump won a second term.
Exactly. And while we're not here to endorse or condemn any political figure...
Of course, we're just exploring the ideas from the sources you sent in.
Right, right. And what we see in some of these articles is a fascinating parallel between the Pilgrims' fervor and the intense devotion of Trump's supporters.
So you're saying there's a connection between how the Pilgrims thought and the mindset of some Trump voters.
In a bigger picture sense, Andersen might argue that some Trump supporters, with their unwavering belief in a certain narrative, despite evidence to the contrary, they echo the Pilgrims' zealotry. It's like America has always had this tension between idealism and a firm grasp on reality.
Wow, that is a lot to process. We went from Plymouth Rock to Trump's second term pretty quickly. I think we need a minute to let all this sink in.
I agree. This deep dive into Fantasyland, it's just getting started. It really makes you think, doesn't it? We've gone from this simple Thanksgiving story to something much more complicated and unsettling, to be honest.
It's like the Thanksgiving story we all learned in school. Someone took it and just flipped it completely around.
Yeah.
Really makes you think about how often we create these stories, these narratives, to try to make sense of the world, even if they're not totally true.
That's exactly what Andersen is getting at with this Fantasyland idea. It's not about believing in fairy tales or, ghosts. It's this bigger cultural thing, prioritizing belief over evidence, emotion over reason.
And he sees that throughout American history, right? From the Pilgrims all the way to, well, pretty much everything.
Exactly. And he gives all these examples that are really wow, the Salem witch trials, for instance, mass hysteria, unfounded accusations, people getting executed.
Talk about fear and magical thinking taking over and how dangerous that can be.
Absolutely. And he traces this thread through so many different things. Spiritualism in the 19th century, conspiracy theories, even the New Age movement in the 60s and 70s.
So this Fantasyland idea, we're seeing it play out over centuries. But let's come back to the present. We were talking about those parallels between the Pilgrims and all that fervor around Trump's second term.
Right, right. And this is where things get even more interesting and maybe a little controversial too. Andersen might say that Trump himself embodies this Fantasyland mentality.
How so?
Think about it. Trump's whole career, it's built on spectacle, exaggeration. Not exactly a stickler for the facts. He's a showman, playing to the crowd, creating his own version of reality.
And a lot of his supporters, they seem to accept that reality.
Right.
Even when it goes against, what we can actually verify.
Exactly. Andersen would probably point to that unwavering belief, that loyalty to Trump's narrative, as a modern example of the same thing that drove the Pilgrims, choosing belief over evidence, feeling over fact.
So how does this Fantasyland thing, how does it show up in the reactions to Trump's actual policies?
Look at some of the issues that really pushed him into power. Immigration, for example. Trump tapped into this deep fear of the other, this idea of immigrants as criminals, a danger to American values.
And that narrative, it worked for a lot of people, even though the data shows that immigrants actually commit crimes at a lower rate than people born in America.
It's about appealing to emotion, fear, anxiety, instead of actually looking at the data, the facts, the nuances.
We see something similar with his economic policies too, right? He promised to bring back jobs, rebuild American industry. But a lot of economists say that his policies mainly help the wealthy, not the working class he claimed to be fighting for.
And yet his supporters stayed loyal. They believed those promises. They held on to the narrative he created.
It's like what Andersen is saying, that America has always had this vulnerability maybe to magical thinking, this willingness to believe in a reality that we want to be true, even if it's not supported by the facts.
That's a great way to put it. And it makes you ask some big questions. If this is so deeply rooted in American culture, what does it mean for our future? Can we balance our idealism, our optimism, with a commitment to reality?
Those are huge questions. I don't know if we have the answers. This whole deep dive, it's really challenged my own assumptions about Thanksgiving, about America, about truth and belief.
That's what's so powerful about looking at history, at cultural critiques like this. It forces us to confront our own biases, our own tendency to, slip into magical thinking, to look at the world in a more critical, thoughtful way.
I bet our listeners are feeling that too. This isn't exactly Like light Thanksgiving dinner table conversation.
Maybe not, but it's a conversation we need to have, especially now. So much information out there, everyone retreating into their own little echo chambers.
Agreed. So we've covered Fantasyland, the Pilgrims, even Trump. What else is in that stack of sources our listeners sent in? Where do we go from here?
It would be fascinating to look at the psychology of all of this. What makes us so susceptible to believing things that might not be true? How do our brains work that way?
Ooh, a deep dive into the human mind. I'm in, if you are.
Let's do it. There's an article here about cognitive biases, another one on the psychology of belief systems. This could get really interesting.
So we've been talking about this magical thinking. This tendency to sometimes choose belief over actual evidence and how it's like baked into American culture. But it's not just an American thing, is it? It feels like it's something we all struggle with, at least a little bit.
Oh, for sure. It's definitely a human thing, and that's part of what makes it so interesting to look into.
Okay, so let's dive into, the psychology of all this. Why are we humans so drawn to believe in things, even when there's a chance they might not be true?
Well, this article you sent in on cognitive biases, it's really helpful. Explains how our brains are wired to take shortcuts. They want to make sense of the world, but fast, even if it means using faulty assumptions or, incomplete information.
So you're saying our brains are kind of lazy. They just want to find the easiest answer, even if it's not the right one.
Lazy might not be the best word. Our brains are all about efficiency. They're constantly getting hit with info, so they develop these mental shortcuts, these biases. Helps us navigate the world more efficiently.
But those shortcuts, they can lead us astray, right? We can end up making decisions or forming beliefs that aren't really based on logic or evidence.
Exactly. One example is confirmation bias. We tend to look for information that backs up our existing beliefs and just ignore stuff that contradicts them.
Oh yeah, I see that all the time. People scrolling through social media just looking for stuff that agrees with them. Anything that challenges them, they just dismiss it.
It's like we're building these echo chambers of belief, surrounding ourselves with stuff that makes us comfortable, even if it's not totally accurate.
And that can be kind of dangerous.
Yeah.
Especially with important stuff like politics, healthcare, climate change.
Absolutely. When we're not open to different perspectives, when we don't really examine the evidence, well, it's easy to get sucked into misinformation, propaganda, manipulation.
So confirmation bias, that's one way our brains can kind of trick us into magical thinking.
Yeah.
What are some other cognitive biases to look out for?
Well, there's the availability heuristic. It's where we overestimate the likelihood of something happening because it's easy to remember or really vivid in our memory.
Oh, so if I see a news story about a plane crash, I might suddenly freak out about flying, even though statistically, it's still one of the safest ways to travel.
Exactly. Our brains latch onto that dramatic image, that scary story, and it messes with our sense of risk.
And that can cause all sorts of irrational fears and anxieties.
For sure. And then there's the bandwagon effect.
Yeah.
We're more likely to believe something if a bunch of other people believe it too.
Good old peer pressure. We're social creatures. We have this, instinct to go along with the group, even if the group might be wrong.
In a way, it's a survival instinct. Way back when, if everyone in your tribe was running away from something, probably a good idea to run too, even if you didn't know why.
But these days, just blindly following the crowd, well, it can lead to some pretty bad stuff.
You're right. So it's important to be aware of these biases, these mental shortcuts. Try to engage with the world in a more critical, thoughtful way.
Okay, so we talked about cognitive biases.
Yeah.
What about that article on belief systems? What did it say about why we believe what we believe?
That article argues that our belief systems are often shaped by how we were raised, our cultural background, even our emotional needs.
So it's not just about, cold, hard logic. Our emotions actually play a role in what we believe.
Oh, absolutely. Our beliefs, they give us a sense of meaning, purpose, belonging. They help us make sense of the world, our place in it.
So, if someone grew up in a religious household, they might be more likely to believe in God, even if they haven't personally seen a miracle or something.
Right. Our beliefs are often passed down through families, embedded in traditions, cultural norms.
And those beliefs, they can be really hard to shake, even if we see evidence that contradicts them.
Exactly. Because challenging someone's beliefs, it can feel like a personal attack on their identity, their sense of self.
Wow. So it's not just about facts and logic. It's about who we are, how we see the world, and our need to feel connected to something bigger than ourselves.
That's a really important point, and it shows why these kinds of conversations can be so tough. We got to approach them with empathy, with respect, even when we disagree.
Okay, so after all this whole deep dive,
Yeah.
what's the big takeaway? What do we want our listeners to remember as they head into their Thanksgiving celebrations?
I think the main thing is we all do this magical thinking thing to some extent. It's part of being human. But by understanding how our brains work, by being more aware of our own biases, well, we can be better thinkers, more careful about the information we consume, more open to different points of view.
That's so important, especially now. So much information thrown at us, so many different opinions, competing narratives. We got to be able to sort through it all, figure out what's true, what's not, make good decisions based on evidence, not just our feelings or beliefs.
Couldn't agree more. And as we wrap up, this quote from Carl Sagan keeps coming to mind. It pays to keep an open mind, but not so open, your brains fall out.
Love that.
Yeah.
So to our listeners, as you get together with family and friends this Thanksgiving, remember that the story we tell about the Pilgrims, it's just one version of events. Be curious, ask questions, and don't be afraid to, question your own assumptions. You might discover something surprising and maybe even spark some really interesting conversations around the dinner table.
Happy Thanksgiving, everyone, and thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Fantasyland.